Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all today for participating in our webinar at the Gulf International Forum on energy flows and military escalations. How does the war in Ukraine affect the Gulf? On the face of it, the Russian invasion of Ukraine would seem to be very far away geographically and only of passing concern for the countries of the Gulf. In fact, their interests are exposed and deeply in the thick of it. Collectively, the seven Gulf countries are the biggest oil and gas exporting nations in the region of the world. And Russia's decision to invade Ukraine may have been for other geopolitical reasons, but oil and gas will play a huge role in how the crisis develops. Russia provides almost 40% of Europe's energy, oil and gas, and the war threatens to disrupt it. If it disrupts it, it will have and it already has a direct and immediate effect on the Gulf and is going to get more complicated. As of Monday night, Brent crude hit $122 a barrel, a percentage increase not seen since the oil embargo of 1974. Other indexes showed comparable surges. No GCC country can surge enough oil or LNG to make a dent in those prices, but there will be consequences, some bad, some good for them. Iran can make a difference if, and this is a big if it can reach an agreement on restoring the JCPOA and lifting American oil sanctions quickly. It has more than 100 million barrels in floating storage that could sail within days of the lifting of sanctions and can probably surge another 1.5 million barrels a day within a few weeks. No matter what transpires, however, the Gulf states, without exception, are contemplating a massive surge in revenues, a surge that would have been unthinkable a few weeks ago, and which promises to fatten their coffers. For some of the Gulf countries, of course, this could not have come a moment too soon. The country that is the most to gain or to lose from the Ukraine war is Iran. The war has, as we noted above, sent oil prices surging, and Iran is the only country with some limited surge capacity if it can finish with the JCPOA. Russia is as close an ally as Tehran has in the world. What happens to Russia will directly affect Iran. Politically, the Gulf countries appear rather nervous and ambivalent about what side to take. Qatar came out of the starting gate with the most pro-Ukrainian position. The UAE initially abstained on the UN Security Council resolution concerning Russia, but has now moved more towards a pro-Ukrainian position. The other GCC countries at the beginning seemed reluctant to fall in line. In fact, most of them sort of disappeared for the first few days. Even Iran has criticized Russia for throwing a monkey wrench into the JCPOA negotiations. All the Gulf countries must assess their relationships with other outside players, first and foremost the United States, which seeks a unified anti-Russian pro-Ukrainian front. Russia has other interests and the means to get people's attention as well, while Turkey, a player in the Gulf, is now fully engaged in what is happening. We have assembled some very, very qualified experts to bring some order out of the confused picture. I won't take up time with their bios. They are on the announcement. First speaker is Dr. Diana Galieva, who is currently an academic visitor at St. Anthony's College, who will speak on the Gulf countries and the Gulf countries' reaction to this. I seem to have gotten my papers mixed up as usual. And anyway, Dr. Galieva.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this kind invitation to join such an important discussion today. In comparison to 2014, about the views on the Russian annexation of Crimea, when the Gulf states' responses were very strict neutral, today we can hear the very loud voices from the Gulf states. On the strict neutrality, we can see Bahrain's position, and which hasn't expressed a clear position on conflict. given that it's close security relations with the United States, but at the same time remaining as one of the major non-NATO allies. At the same time, from my research, I could also I learned that Bahrain is also aims to maintain and develop relations with Moscow, as Manama wants to expand its international relations with all major powers. That seems to me that Manama will not change its position in the future. Oman's position is quite similar, also showed very neutral stance on the conflict, and this reflects the normal, usual Omani foreign policy's position of neutrality. Saudi Arabia's position has perhaps the most challenging balancing act to maintain between Riyadh and Moscow. Riyadh has so far been very careful not to take a position in the war, even indirectly. For example, citing the need to preserve the production agreement among OPEC and non-OPEC countries in the OPEC Plus deal, it refused President Biden's call to pump more oil as prices jumped more than $100 per barrel. At the same time, we also know that President Biden aims to meet with Riyadh leadership, so that might somehow change the position and reaction of Saudi Arabia towards the conflict. Kuwaiti position quite clear, perhaps due to its own historical experience, and Kuwait in 1990 was also invaded by Iraqi forces. However, the most perhaps interesting responses on Russia's military operation so far came from Qatar and United Arab Emirates. On the 6 Gulf states' responses on the Russian actions, Qatar is perhaps the most explicit in its condemnation of Moscow and its support of Ukraine. Qatar's decision directly links with the relations between Washington, but at the same time, we know that it hosts the U.S. military base. At the same time, also relations with Moscow prior 2016, they were quite complex. Doha hosted Chechen separatist Zelimkhan Yanbardiyev also in 2011. We know that Russia's ambassador withdrew from his position after he was beaten by a customs official at Doha's airport. Perhaps the most importantly, Doha tries to gain economically from this conflict. As we know, in January, in the shadow of the Ukrainian build-up, U.S. President Biden approached Sheikh Tamim and asking to redirect gas capacities to the Europe. After the meeting, Qatar was announced as one of the key non-NATO allies, but at the same time, Qatari officials also responded saying that they will not be able to redirect gas to Europe. Other developments also quite interesting. On February 22, Qatar hosted the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, where Doha with other countries, and interestingly, including Russia, they were discussing about these opportunities. And it seems that this conflict creates opportunities to Moscow's main gas competitors, such as Iran and Qatar, which are respectively holds the second and the third largest total gas reserves in the world in the mid-run. We know that Iranian President Raisi visited Doha, and also he attended that forum. And in case the JCPOA will be finalized, it seems that Qatar and Iran also could present challenges to Russia's powerful position as the key energy supplier for Europe, despite now the very strong support of Iranian position towards Russia. And on the fine balancing act, we could see here responses from the United Arab Emirates. On February 23rd, Russian and Emirati foreign ministers Sergei Lavrov and Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, they discussed the two countries' friendly relations. At the same time, on 25th of February, the day after the Russian operation, Sheikh Abdullah and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also discussed Russian attack over the phone. On 26th of February, as already mentioned, UAE obtained the U.S.-based United Nations Security Council resolution opposing for a Russian military operation against Ukraine. So we could see arguably here two regional competitors. I would argue still remains between Qatar and United Arab Emirates. They show very active positions, but they are different. While Doha kind of supports Western side, UAE tries to balance between Russia and the West. Moscow relations with Abu Dhabi lies not just at the federal level, but also quite interestingly how Emiratis have been all this time building relations with regional also at the regional level. For example, with such republics with Muslim populations such as Chechnya, Dagestan, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and others. And finally, I would like to say that traditional close alignment with the Gulf states and Washington has been considerably in transformation in recent years. Every new administration's policies have scaled back U.S. involvement in the region, which has tended to prompt further Moscow and Gulf collaborations. That's why perhaps we could see such neutral positions from the Gulf response. And to sum up, the central impact on the ongoing crisis also will not be just on energy, tourism, and other sectors, but also perhaps will affect to the escalate competition between Gulf states. Thank you so much for your attention.
Dr. Galieva, we'll proceed to the next speaker, but there was one point that has interested me. About a year ago or two, the Gulf states began to conclude that the United States was beginning to withdraw from the region. Do you have any evidence or attempts by the Russian Federation to move into the Gulf as a consequence? Was there any sort of preparatory political or strategic work in the Gulf by the Russians?
Thank you very much for this very important question. I think that's a link with in general with Russia's grand strategies towards the region, and it always been to kind of against the West or US. And we know that during, for example, the Soviet time, there was all the time the Soviets, they were following the policies of zero sum. That means that it was clear alignment with particular states, and the Gulf states at that time, they were pro-Western. And I think with modern kind of Russia and its leadership, that we've been following this kind of balancing act. And they were trying to be and keeping good relations with all sides, and the Gulf states were the key for that policy. And also it's including with these economic advantages and investments which Moscow tried to attract from the Gulf states. But also I would like to express just my point, which I've tried to show, that every single US leadership also kind of helped to put Moscow and Gulf states together. For example, after 9/11, over the the Bush kind of the policies and the Moscow, it affected to the Riyadh and Moscow position closer. And then during the Obama administration also, as it supported the Arab Spring, it was also by some Gulf states being considered as Washington didn't support its long-term kind of alliances with Mubarak or Bin Ali. So, but at the same time, also the position of the Gulf, I think that they saw that basically Moscow came and saved Assad, and that Moscow can be trusted in some way. The other, I think, but the most importantly, that in strengthen that position is that Trump administration's policies during the Gulf crisis, although despite the kind of active support of the quartet at the beginning, and then we could see that the main really winner was the United States with this achieved investments during the Gulf crisis. So and now with the new Biden administration, I think this policies of dividing the world between autocracies and democracies somehow also helps to put Moscow and the Gulf states together.
Thank you. That's a very nice lead-in to Dr. Mark Katz, Professor of Government and Politics at George Mason University, Schar School of Policy and Government, to talk about the giant in the back of the room. What does the United States want from the GCC states collectively and individually during this crisis?
All right, thank you so much for this invitation to be here today. I really appreciate it, and I think that for the United States, in terms of what we want from the GCC in this crisis, really there are three things. One is more oil and gas production. We definitely want them to ramp that up. With obviously, we want people buying less oil and gas from Russia, but people need it, and so we're hoping that our GCC allies will be able to do that. Second, we want cooperation on sanctions. Obviously the West has imposed some serious sanctions on Russia. In the past, with regard to Ukraine-related sanctions, our Middle Eastern partners have not joined in. We would like them to do so. So far, they have not. And third, what we would like is political support for Western positions on this conflict, including at the United Nations. Now, up until now, of course, the US hasn't really gotten any of these things. What's interesting is that the Saudis have made clear that they intend to stick with the OPEC Plus agreement that they have with Russia, that they aren't going to necessarily increase production at all, and therefore, if they did increase production, oil prices might not be quite as high as they are, although they're probably still going to be high. But this is obviously very disappointing for the Biden administration. It doesn't seem that they're interested in cooperating so far on sanctions. And as Dr. Galieva mentioned, the UAE, which is now a member of the Security Council, abstained on the Security Council resolution condemning Russia, along with India and China also abstained on the Security Council. This was really very disappointing. Now, of course, when it came to the UN General Assembly vote, all of our Middle Eastern partners, for the most part, did vote in favor, including the GCC countries, including the UAE. In other words, the UAE vote was different in the General Assembly than it was in the Security Council. But what this shows, I think, this shouldn't come as a surprise. I published a paper some 3 years ago with the Atlantic Council entitled "When the Friend of My Friends is Not My Friend." And I've just sent the link to our moderator, which he may use his discretion about whether he wants to share with the audience. That what we have seen over, since Putin came into office is that each and every American ally in the Middle East now has good relations with Russia. And so this is something that has been, an ongoing process that Putin has achieved. And it's certainly better than the Soviet days when Moscow was trying to, in fact, undermine America's allies. Nevertheless, as I had talked about in this paper, that there is sort of a disjunction that obviously our Gulf allies in particular are mainly concerned about Iran, but that America has a lot of allies, and its allies in different parts of the world are concerned with different adversaries. Certainly, its allies in Europe are more concerned about Russia, and the Middle Eastern allies in the Gulf in particular just are not. In fact, they see Russia as more of a partner, that although Russia and Iran have very close relations, what they see is that they hope certainly that Russia can act to restrain Iran, that in other words, or if they have bad relations with Russia, that Russia could do far more to help Iran, which they don't want to see happen. And so, in other words, it's their concern about Iran and Russia's role in either helping or hindering it that I think motivates them to not be so willing to help the U.S. on Ukraine. Similarly, as Dr. Galieva mentioned, there's obviously, especially now with the Biden administration, compared to the Trump administration, a greater emphasis has been placed on human rights concerns in particular. And this has led the U.S. to be at odds with Saudi Arabia, in particular in terms of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the whole episode with the death of the journalist Adnan Khashoggi, and the Biden administration has made it clear that they're not happy with Mohammed bin Salman, and he obviously resents this very much. Also, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not happy about what they see as a lack of American support when it comes to their policy toward Yemen, which they see themselves as working against Iran there. And the U.S. has decided to raise human rights concerns about their activities. And as far as the Houthis have launched missiles at both Saudi Arabia and now the UAE. And I think both countries feel that the U.S. has not supported them to the extent that they would like. Therefore, why should they be as supportive of the U.S. when it comes to Ukraine? Why is Ukraine more important than they are? Also, I think that what we saw was that when the conflict first broke out, I think there was an expectation that Russia was going to win in Ukraine, fairly quickly and easily. That Ukrainian, in other words, either because its aims would be limited to eastern Ukraine, and they seize the Donbass and sort of declare victory, and that would be and that the Ukrainian government would have to deal with it. Or even if the Ukrainian government, if Russian goals were larger, that it would collapse. In other words, that it would be over and done, and therefore there was no point in working, stating their objections to Russia because there was going to be the winner. Now, of course, we see things are different. I would not be surprised if the Biden administration really put some effort into it, that they could somehow persuade Saudi Arabia and the UAE to increase oil production. Qatar has made clear that there's just not that much more gas that it can produce. So I think that this is one of the some of the things that we are seeing now. There is this tremendous perception in the Gulf that America is not so interested in them, is leaving the region. It seems to me that America's position in the Middle East is actually not that much different from what it was at the very end of the Cold War, that we basically have the same allies then that we have now, that we had an expanded presence in the Middle East after 9/11, and especially after the U.S. intervention in Iraq. We have pulled back from those things, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, but that basically we have the same allies. And people talk about the concern that America is more focused on China, therefore it's not interested in the Middle East. I don't think this is really very sensible. In other words, during the Cold War, when we were at odds with the Soviet Union, we were at odds with the Soviet Union everywhere, every part of the world. And I think that if the competition with China increases, that will be the same. In other words, that this competition will take place in the Middle East as well. That this is actually a reason for the U.S. to stay in the Middle East. But I think that Middle Eastern audiences are acting on the basis of worst case scenarios. Governments always tend to do that, and so I think that is where we are now. And I see that this is my signal to yield. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to let you quite off the hook. And this is sort of an unfair question, because we don't know how things are going to develop over the next several weeks or months in the Ukraine. But do you get any sense that we might see a reordering of American priorities in the region as a result of different countries' willingness or failure to stand up for our side in effect?
That's a very good question, and I had an article recently in The Hill that raised this. In other words, I'm not saying that the U.S. should, but that to the extent that the our Gulf allies, or not just Gulf but Middle Eastern allies in general, are seen as sort of sympathizing with or working with Russia, I think the question is going to arise in the U.S. if they're not worried about Russia, why should we protect them with regard to Iran? In other words, what is it that they are? The alliance seems to be quite contingent on their needs and not ours. And certainly, what I wrote about in this paper is that maybe the U.S. might insist on something of a linkage. You want the U.S. to help you with Iran. You kind of need to help us, at least to some extent, with our other concerns, including Russia. So I think that is, that question is just going to come up. It's not a question of whether it should or not. I think it will come up. And similarly, I think the point that was raised about Iran, and suddenly I think just as with the U.S. is thinking about buying oil from Venezuela, I think there has been a reordering in American threat perception that we don't like Iran, we don't like Venezuela, but they're a lot less trouble than Russia is. And I think that one of the problems American foreign policy has often had is that we tend to prioritize smaller adversaries rather than larger ones. It really irritates us when smaller countries defy us. And I think that this is the kind of crisis where this is a crisis with a major adversary, and therefore maybe we can't afford to have as many adversaries as we had the luxury of having before. And if it means buying oil from Iran and Venezuela, obviously, Biden administration, American politicians, the price of gas in the United States makes a difference for one's electoral prospects. And if buying that oil and gas from Iran and Venezuela will help make a difference, I would not be surprised if we do it.
Thank you. And that's really a remarkable segue into Dr. Samuel Ramani, who's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, to talk about Iran. What's the impact of the crisis on Iran, the JCPOA, who gets incentivized, who doesn't? And does Iran end up being against Russia just for economic advantage? Samuel.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador Theros, for organizing this panel, and to the two previous speakers for their excellent remarks. Yeah, I would like to provide, first of all, just a brief overview of how the Iranians have responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that says about the immediate state of Russia-Iran relations. And then take, as Ambassador Theros says, a broader view of what this might mean for the long-term trajectory of Russia-Iran relations, as well as Iran's place within the international system and the future of the JCPOA. So, with regards to the initial Iranian reaction, Iran largely sided with Russia in this conflict. Ebrahim Raisi, as president, had a call with Vladimir Putin within 24 hours of the invasion, and basically attributed the situation in Ukraine to the chaos relating to NATO expansion. Ayatollah Khamenei basically built on those statements in a separate tweeted statement later in the week, where he accused the United States of being a mafia regime, he accused the United States of creating ISIS, engaging in foreign regime changes, installing pro-Western politicians. He even used the phrase color revolutions to describe what happened in Euromaidan in 2014, which is obviously the phrase that Russia loves to use as well. So it was a direct pandering towards Russian discourse. And this is hardly surprising, because Iran and Russia have a long history of alignment on major international crises. The Iranians and the Russians both oppose the independence of Kosovo, for example, and they both oppose the NATO military intervention there. They both are opposed to the NATO military intervention in Libya. And on specific crises relating to Russia, the Iranians have tended to either acquiesce to the Russian line without necessarily adopting it fully. So not criticizing Russia, but not really defending Russia either. In the context of Georgia, for example, in 2008, we saw Mahmoud Ahmadinejad chastise NATO and its expansionist tendencies and kind of create some kind of a NATO Zionist conspiracy that was creating instability in the international order. Other Iranian officials were a lot more concerned about diplomacy and throwing a more cautious line, in part because Iran has a historical relationship with Georgia. After 2014 in Ukraine, it was a very similar response. Hassan Rouhani obviously was a little more attuned to appeasing Western ears because the interim agreement was already in place and the Iranians were moving towards a larger, broader nuclear grand bargain. But Rouhani basically did not basically stayed on the sidelines and did not accept the recognition, obviously, of Crimea as being part of Russia or any changes later on with the special status of Donbass. So Iran's overall position, which has been to, in general, not vote with Russia in the UNGA. They abstained. They didn't join the North Koreas, the Syrias, the Eritreas by voting with them, but also criticizing this as a crisis that was manufactured largely by the West through color revolutions and through NATO expansion, is very much in line with their previous rhetoric and what they've previously done. The Iranians are not going to take the step most likely to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk anytime soon, even though the Houthis have already followed that course and Bashar al-Assad has followed that course. That's just one point to note, in part because Iran's got latent concerns, obviously, about their own separatist problems. So everything from the Kurds, the Azeris, to others, they're not going to want to rock the boat over here by directly endorsing separatism. Moreover, there's also a bit of a domestic divide inside Iran on this. That's quite interesting. When you get below the surface of just the Ayatollah and Raisi, and you start looking at more a diverse array of perspectives. For example, there was an interesting quote from Heshmatullah Falaptise, who was the senior lawmaker, former chairman of the Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, who basically claimed that Vladimir Putin had a legitimate case of being tried in the International Criminal Court. And that made it out in mostly moderate and reformist Iranian media outlets. And Putin was directly compared by Slobodan Milosevic to some others. They were also being compared to being an expansionist. So, in general, there is a typical, as one would expect, a division within the Iranian political spectrum about this. There's no single reaction. And the Iranian position, which is endorsing Russia's rationale for getting involved in Ukraine, but that actually endorsing the consequences of the invasion, seems very much aimed at appeasing these domestic divisions inside the country, especially as now some Iranian civil society, youth protesters like the Islamic student movement, The Search of Justice, has urged Iran to take a firmer stance against Russia's violations of international law. That's just a little bit about the domestic reaction inside Iran and some of the nuances within it, which I think is quite interesting from that perspective. And now let's turn to the big question that everybody is focusing on with regards to this. How will this impact Russia-Iran relations? Well, obviously, Iran wants to maintain, in general, is trying to maintain favorable relations with all of the conflicting parties in this conflict. Before 2020, before that jet shoot down, Iran had a workable and productive bilateral relationship with Ukraine. Ukraine had a consistent embassy presence in Tehran, for example. The Iranians also have a close relationship with Belarus, right, which is a co-aggressor in this conflict. The Iranians and Belarusians signed a series of agreements strengthening cooperation from 2006, 2008 in particular, and the Iranians have backed the Belarusians during Lukashenko's election turmoil, and the Belarusians have done the same during periods of crisis in Iran, like the 2009 Green Movement. So there's a good set of relationships here between Iran and all the major stakeholders here, which is another reason why geopolitically they're backing Russia, but not quite going all the way. So that's just a note about their interactions inside the region. With respect to how it will impact the broader systemic concerns, I think that there's an immediate concern now inside Iran that the Russians are going to put the brakes on the movement towards the JCPOA. And it was clear from Sergei Lavrov's statement yesterday, which caused quite a bit of alarm inside Tehran, about the Russians basically seeking exemptions from any kind of commercial agreements with Iran from their own sanctions that they've had facing there. The Iranian ambassador to Moscow tried to put a little bit of cold water on that dispute and try to say that maybe Lavrov's words were somewhat misinterpreted. But there's obviously a sign of concern and a sign of worry about that. Moreover, there's also a concern that the Russians might not be supportive of Iran flooding the market with new oil reserves, particularly bringing 2 million barrels of oil into the market, because obviously that Iran, along with the U.S. outreach towards Venezuela, as Professor Katz was saying, would lead to some alternative suppliers that would probably aid the divestment from Russia. The Russians already have a lot in their pocket, looking at the divestments to Azerbaijan and to Turkmenistan and to Qatar and to Algeria, some of which have mixed levels of extra energy capacity. And the last thing they need is another country in that market, which would come from Iran. So there are concerns inside Iran, definitely, and we've seen it from the media and from official statements, that Russia is either trying to delay or impede this agreement from taking place, and it also doesn't want oil entering the market. But on the other hand, the Russians have a desire to want to see the Iran the JCPOA be rectified. First of all, Russia is facing severe international isolation right now, and is desperate to have the image of itself as an order builder on the world stage, and to be seen as a constructive stakeholder on the world stage, and to be given prestige, status, and recognition. So the very fact that the Americans have to engage quite closely with the Russians at this moment in time is valuable from a status perspective. And I would recommend you look at some of the comments that have been coming in particular from Mikhail Ulyanov, who's Russia's representative to permanent international organizations in Vienna, who has talked about how the Ramani is having to work in lockstep with the Russians and the Chinese, sometimes even making concessions to the Iranians that are more than what they would like. So thumbing their nose at the Americans, they basically make the Americans make concessions to the Iranians that they wouldn't otherwise do, and having Russia being seen as somewhat involved in that, as well as having Russia as an order builder and as a line of consultation, is something that the Russians would probably want to maintain. It's important that even during previous crises, like the poisoning of Navalny or the annexation of Crimea or the Skripal incident, Russia and Europe maintained regular dialogue on the JCPOA and its dissolution and its aftermath, and this is something that's not new. And moreover, there's the possibility, particularly in this unrestrained kind of climate of nuclear hysteria that we're seeing here, that a discussion on reining in the Iranian nuclear program could lead to some revival of discussions on arms control more broadly. We were already seeing the Russians quietly try to arrange a North and South Korean trilateral format of the North Korean issue too, though that might be disrupted now because South Korea has been labeled as an unfriendly country, and they've also been imposing sanctions on the Russian central bank and SWIFT and towing the Western line. So proliferation in that point of view. So that's why the status and order building objectives that would pull around Russia in the direction of letting this deal go through, but there's some other immediate economic incentives that would push against it. That's just generally how I see it. A brief note on how Russia would view, is viewing Iranian destabilizing activity in the region at this moment in time. Obviously, the crisis in Ukraine occurred very much in the aftermath of Iran and the Houthis, by proxy, engaging in much more aggressive drone strikes on the United Arab Emirates. And what we've interestingly seen in a nod to the UAE since the invasion, there have been UNSC meetings on the situation in Yemen, and the Russians have generally been condemning those drone strikes. So they've been taking a bit of a firmer stance. Interestingly, there was a UN tightening of the arms embargo against the Houthis, which the Russians behind the scenes in the United Nations did not move to veto. So that, which they may have done in the past, those resolutions moved forward. So the Russians are also making sure that they're not overly dependent on Iran because of this anti-Western axis in this moment of isolation, and making winks and points to the UAE and to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia on the Houthi threat that would maintain that regional balance and that policy of maintaining friends with everyone in the Gulf, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Iranians. So that's just one other point that I wanted to bring up with regards to that. And is there going to be any impact briefly on the situation right now inside Syria? Well, I so far have not really seen any disagreements between Russia and Turkey on the Ukraine crisis, with Turkey condemning the invasion and blocking Russian warships spilling over into the Syrian file. Though if Turkey's talks that they're trying to broker between Galeeva and Lavrov break down and Syrian mercenaries enter the conflict, all bets are off, and we could see some Russian and Iranian coordination or movement of patterns over there too. We should watch out for that. So that's just a brief lay of the land on what I see happening with regards to the just reacting reaction to the JCPOA and just a few other miscellaneous issues regarding Iran and Russia.
I have one short question that I think a lot of people in the audience don't know. Russia has a specific, almost mechanical role to play in the JCPOA. Could you briefly describe what that is and whether if the Russians don't cooperate, it makes the JCPOA impossible?
Right. So, I mean, I would say that the Russians obviously play a big role as one of the P5+1 players, and that they to some degree, they're kind of like a guarantor, and they're a player that needs to be able to bring it forward and to move it along. Also, obviously, the Russians, in a more informal way, have acted to some degree as a communicator or a dialogue facilitator between Iran and the West. Because if you look at some of the rhetoric on the JCPOA in December and January of this year, the Russians were aligning a lot more with the Iranians on the issue that sanctions should be removed without preconditions and that we should have talks, or that the agreement was moving ahead in a direction that was positive when the West was saying no, it wasn't. So the Russians play both, obviously, a P5+1 important role inside it, and also they have historically, in spite of all the tensions between Russia and the West, played a bit of a guarantor role. It's interesting to note that when Emmanuel Macron, who has been arguably the European leader who's most concertedly trying to engage in diplomacy with Russia then and now, the JCPOA has come up as an area of discussion, and that facilitation role has probably occurred more through informal messaging too. So those are some of the ways in which Russia has played a role in it. To quote Mikhail Ulyanov's in late January, Russia plays the role of an honest broker, to my mind. That's kind of what he's trying to do.
Thank you. And now we've talked the politics, we've talked the what people might do, and we're getting down to, let's take it by the numbers, the hard facts. Dr. Rauf Mammadov, currently a senior advisor at Sfolden Company and formerly a top official at the state oil company of Azerbaijan. Tell us, what are the facts? What can the Gulf states do and not do? Or what are their capacities? What can they surge and what can't they? Dr. Mammadov.
Thank you for having me on this great panel. Gulf countries have, as it was perfectly explained by my colleagues here, have for the last 5 years have accelerated their pivot towards Russia, and they've built bilateral relations and the relations within international institutions such as OPEC Plus and gas exporting countries. So their reaction or their actions in respect to the Ukrainian crisis wasn't surprising to me as well. In terms of their capacities, Gulf countries, I mean, we have to divide them between the oil exporters and gas exporter, namely Qatar, and as an oil exporter as Saudi Arabia and the others. They can do a lot in terms of stabilizing the market by actually producing more or making assuring statements which will create some relief from the ongoing crisis. But their actions are also constrained by the both geopolitical reality and also by the economic realities as well. It's important to understand that the rise in the oil prices, for instance, was a phenomenon that was already taking place before the Ukrainian crisis. The prices were on upward direction before that. Of course, the Ukraine war has caused a spike, but the fundamental problem in the oil market was that, not the problem, but the situation in the oil market was that the world economy was recovering. Simultaneously, the demand for energy products, energy commodities, oil and gas especially, were ramping up, and the underinvestment made both in oil and gas sectors for last 2 years because of the COVID pandemic has caused. But was one of the reasons why this was happening. So the market was tight, anyways, and before we're discussing the post-Ukraine war or ongoing crisis attitude of Gulf countries, we have to also look at the prior attitude of these countries as well. And when we look at especially the oil producing countries and the key players in the global oil market, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, we see that their attitude wasn't towards creating more, ramping up the production and bring the prices down. Their actions were more in respect to, keeping the production quotas in the level that they deem necessary, and not answering the demands from the Western world in respect to trying to ramp up more production and easing up the quotas and stabilizing the prices. So the attitude of these countries hasn't changed at all. And the reason because it has changed was that for the last 5-6 years, the Gulf countries, especially the UAE and the Saudi Arabia, has been deviating from the United States orbit towards Russia and China. We saw for the first time in the history, we saw the visits of the reigning kings of both Saudi Arabia and UAE to Russia. We saw unprecedented level of cooperation and economic cooperation and investments made especially by the UAE in Russia, and we saw a perfect example of a creation of a triumvirate within OPEC Plus. I mean, commonly it's known that it's Saudi Arabia and Russia are behind the key drivers of the OPEC Plus, but UAE's role is usually underrated. But that's not the case. UAE plays not in terms of the production, but politically within OPEC dynamics, they play at least as important role as others. So their attitude in that regard hasn't changed, and the reason was that they're leaving the United States orbit, and they're pivoting towards more balanced approach. When you look at this is about the oil, but when we look at the gas is a completely different animal. It's a completely different commodity when it comes to the geopolitics and the economics. Qatar has as the largest exporter, one of the largest exporters of gas and the largest exporter of LNG in the world, can ramp up the production. Also, it's bound with technical capabilities, but the problem is that will not ease the challenges that Europe will be facing if Russia cuts exports, or if there is a gas deficit in parts of the world, Europe. Qatar's gas is only feasible or only valuable for the countries that can import the gas, because they can import the countries that are not landlocked, basically. For the countries that are located in the Central Europe or Southeastern Europe that doesn't have access to the oceans, it doesn't matter how much Qatar will ramp up the production. It will have no effect in their ability of importing the gas if there is no pipeline gas that is supplying gas to them, and which is basically Russian pipeline gas. So there is technical constraints, and there are to both Qatar's and Saudi Arabia's and UAE's actions, but there is also a strong political will as well. And when we look at their attitude, we should also look at it's not discussed, but their UAE has made billions of investments in Russia. Only in 2021, Mubadala, the sovereign investment fund of UAE, has made $1 billion investments, including in the energy sector. Qatar's Qatar Investment Authority has purchased Rosneft's 4.5%, and none of these countries have made any statements regarding quitting any projects in this regard. So when we look at the attitude of the Gulf states from the energy perspective, we'll have to look at it from geopolitical standpoint, from the historic path of the last 5-6 years, how these relations between Gulf and Russia, Gulf states and Russia, has evolved. We also have to look at it from the commercial, economic, and technical reality perspective to understand whether they can actually be a silver bullet to this big challenge.
Thank you very much. There is a question that just came in that I think is really for Rauf more than anyone else. Capacity problems. There were two parts of it. Republicans are calling for Biden to open up U.S. oil production. I think we all agree that opening up is just a word, that you really can't that easily. But if you could just elaborate about what the United States can do, and about what the capacity of Europe to a little bit more than what you said, the capacity of Europe to receive more LNG and to distribute it within Europe.
In terms of the ramping up the production in the United States, that politicians or media usually likes to look at everything from white paper standpoint. If it makes sense to them when they write it or when they connect the dots, then they think that it's feasible. Ramping up the production takes a lot of time. There is a term called lead time in the oil and gas business, which means the time where you make the investment decision and then the time when you actually get the oil or gas from the ground. So there is that. It's not it doesn't happen in one day or in 1 week. Actually, what what the United States can do is to bring more countries into these coalitions of willing 2.0, I think, who will, by creating, especially with the oil producing countries such as Venezuela, that will, or Iran, that will agree to, to bring as much oil as possible to the market, and to create some stability in the market, because market is driven by fundamentals, by the actual oil and gas production and demand. Market is also driven by geopolitical developments. So if the world sees that there's a strong multilateral approach, including from the Venezuela and Iran, and then they see it in the numbers as well, then we will see the price stabilization. And that, I think it was already mentioned here, Biden administration is in dire need of actually bringing these prices down, because according to different calculations, but every $10-15 increase in the oil prices will result a significant change in the gas pump prices in the United States. And in this midterm election year, it will be a huge challenge for the current administration. It's also emblematic of how interdependent the world is, and how cautious or how attentive you should be by making these policies, by making these decisions, in order to prevent from yourself shooting yourself on your own foot. So that's the only reason. That's probably the main reason why today Russian oil and gas export, which provides the big chunk of the Russian budget revenues, is not sanctioned, because by doing so, the West will create more problems in terms of more economic problems, especially for the oil and gas importing countries, and including the United States. United States could be one of the largest producers in the world, actually one of the 3 largest oil and gas producers in the world, but it's still one of the largest importers of oil in the world. So it will have an impact on its economy as well. So I think the multilateral approach and ramping up the production from wherever you can is the only option that is on the table at the moment.
Thank you. There's one thing I briefly alluded to when we started, and none of you have mentioned it very much since then. The other elephant in the room after the United States was China. You didn't mention China because, in fact, China has no significant role to play in the Gulf and Gulf's relationship with the Ukraine crisis, or have I missed something? I'll take whoever wants to volunteer first.
Well, obviously, China is a huge buyer. I think it's estimated that China now buys 2 million barrels of oil a day just from Saudi Arabia. So obviously, they actually have the same interests as the U.S. They would like to see the Gulf states and certainly Iran increase their production, because this is something that they're paying for too. So interestingly enough, I think the U.S. and China actually have a certain degree of common interests here, which are not Russia's interests.
Yeah, I would basically say that. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so I would agree basically with what Professor Katz is saying, and also I would just want to add a few comments just about how China's reaction might impact the Gulf. I think that what we've been noticing over the past several days is that China is definitely, much like Iran, sympathizing with the security rationales that Russia has claimed necessitated this intervention, particularly with regards to NATO expansion, and particularly with regards to that perceived U.S. threat towards Russia. And Chinese media outlets have parroted off a lot of Russian lines about neo-Nazism in Ukraine and about just this whole notion of violent extremism, much like the way they did in 2014. But there also are some concerns and some trouble spots ahead. It's true that China did sign a series of gas deals with Russia during the Beijing Olympics, which it'll be able to use to its advantage. But there's also concerns about how the U.S. sanctions against Russia might exactly impact the implementation of some of those deals. We already saw the Bank of China and the ICBC in the 3 days after the invasion start questioning or start reducing some of its financing of raw material purchases from Russia, Similarly, symbolic because it's only $800 million worth of projects. The Asian Investment Bank has also pulled out of this. So the point is, China is obviously seeing some geopolitical benefits of having Russia more dependent on it, but equally, it's concerned from an energy perspective what high oil prices mean and whether it can rely so overwhelmingly on Russia. So I would say, given that concern about the long-term reliance on Russia and the unpredictability of Russian behavior, I think they're certainly going to welcome the entry of Iranian oil into the market. And also Venezuelan oil for that matter, too, because the Chinese were always a little less doctrinaire on confronting the US and Venezuela than the Russians were.
If I may, can
yes.
I
please.
this as well? I just from the point of view of the global balance of power and shifts and how the conflict will, in which direction it will take, I think it's also important. I mean, because there were before the even conflict, there were these discussions about new Cold War and how it's perceived. Is it like between US and Russia or US and China? And here I think also it will have a great impact. I mean, the outcomes of the conflict. The other issue as well, the perhaps economic one, and from the Russian press, if I may just to add some news about the kind of the exports. So mainly because of the old technology, for example, not be able to bring to from Germany, for example, they are expecting to bring it from China, but also expectations from United Arab Emirates. So that would be interesting. Although there are some discussions how the sanctions will affect, how they will overcome all of this, but also interesting the dynamics that perhaps Russia will rely on these partners kind of in the economic field as well.
Well, you've raised an interesting question about the trade between countries that we have sanctioned. Does anyone see any indication that the sort of the alternative banking systems that these different countries have been proposing since American sanctions got bigger and more widespread, if they will grow, if they can become more effective, and if there might be a tendency to include some of the Gulf states in them, particularly Iran? Since I don't know the answer to that question, I'm counting on you guys.
So just a brief comment. Yeah, de-dollarization has obviously been something the Russians have been talking about for some time. And when they talk about target countries outside of China that they want to bring to challenge the SWIFT monopoly and challenge the US dollar, 3 countries very often come up in the Russian media: Iran, Turkey, Pakistan. And then of course always some smaller states like Syria, North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba enter the mix. But those are the larger ones that do seem to come up. So there's a lot of talk about this, there's a lot of discussions about this. I don't know, there's really not much evidence of the extent to which the Russians, Chinese, and Iranians have coordinated yet on a post-SWIFT monetary order, particularly now that it's something that's more real from the Russian point of view. The Chinese have come to Russia's assistance on the credit card issue, but not really much in terms of Iran. But it's important to keep in mind that we're coming at a moment where Russian and Iranian economic relations were improving quite robustly. The day before the invasion, actually, the Iranians released some official statistics, and there was a meeting of the Iran-Russia Joint Chamber of Commerce, which showed that there was a 60% increase in Russian-Iranian trade. So this is coming at a moment when there's a lot of momentum coming over here, with particularly in the petrochemical sphere, but also just in terms of ports and logistical capacities coming through from Astrakhan. So if the European Union and the US now start sanctioning port movements and shipping transit, which is something that they've been talking about, and Iran is getting out of the sanctions with the JCPOA, some of these things get a little touchy. There's also some existing sanctions busting techniques that are in place. Crimea, for example, in 2019 had invited Iran to use its ports to get around that. So that could somewhat be used. So we should really watch what's happening with regards to how things fare with regards to trade and exports. If Iran gets out of sanctions and Russia gets sucked into them, and also in ports and shipping, because this is coming at a moment when Russia-Iran banking ties and commercial ties are doing very well. And now there's a lot of uncertainty.
Also, I would like to add about another point. I think after 2019 annexation Crimea, there were a lot of discussions about the Islamic kind of investments. I'm not sure how the sanctions will be outcome, but since 2014, there were a lot of discussions how the Russian kind of law could be changed in terms of the having this Islamic finance, Islamic banking to work, because there were some minor kind of work in that direction, but there are some issues with legislation. Perhaps there is also this kind of opportunities are open of bringing some investment through that stage, but I think we have to see how all of these alternatives will work.
Thank you. There was another question. One of our audience asked if we are not exaggerating to say that Qatar has adopted the Western or the pro-American position on this war in the Ukraine. And let me expand a bit on that. Are we seeing a bit of a reordering? Qatar came right out of the off the chalks straight into a very, very pro-Western, very, very pro-Ukrainian position. And the rest sort of followed. Does this change or affect the relationship between the GCC countries?
I think this question emerged after my comments and after my opening remarks. Why I kind of stated that Qatar supported Ukrainian positions due to the tweet which presented by Vladimir Zelensky, who mentioned that after the Russian operation, so straight away kind of Sheikh Tamim showed support to Qatar. I think all of us that saw. Perhaps I mean there are some. After Al-Ula summit, I still believe that there are some kind of not existing trust between the Gulf states. That's why they still remain competitors. And I think Dr. Samuel Ramani, mentioned very rightly about this Houthi attacks on the United Arab Emirates. At the same time, just after them happened this Raisi visit to Qatar. So there are still the same, I think, old dynamics are happening in the Gulf, and at some point also the conflict might open new kind of divisions, and maybe some states will find different positions and how they can take advantage from the conflict.
Anyone else? Another country that is one of the most important Gulf countries that we have not mentioned at all. Does Iraq play a role in any of this? Does Iraq have the capacity to surge oil exports? Does Iraq have other influences?
Well, except Saudi Arabia, actually, no one has a spare capacity to increase. So that's for the beginning. And Saudi Arabia's capacity has been or the capacity to increase or the willingness to increase has been questioned many times. The Iraq in this situation has been ramping up its production already, and has been becoming a key oil exporter. Iraq's plans to ramp up its production has always been ambitious, and they have recently walked the walk as well. They have been successful in doing so, but individually, Iraq will not be able to surge its production, to ramp up its production very fast, and in short term, I don't see that happening. But in the longer run, that could be the case. Having said that, there is a small note. Lukoil, Russian largest private oil company, is big in Iraq. So it will be interesting to see how that impacts Lukoil's activities as well. Lukoil is not state-owned as Gazprom Neft, Gazprom, Rosneft, majority state-owned as Gazprom, Rosneft, or Gazprom Neft, but its projects is largely dependent on state subsidies and tax breaks as well. Russia has a very complex tax break system, which is contingent to the oil prices and which divides the revenue between the state and the companies. So it will be interesting to see how it will affect Lukoil and how Lukoil's business will be affected in Iraq and elsewhere in the world.
That's a very interesting point. I did not realize that. Are there other significant Russian investments any place in the Gulf countries? And if so, are they likely to be the targets of more American sanctions?
Russian, it's actually vice versa. Gulf states have been tending to invest more in Russia, and that actually was the goal of this rapprochement between Russia and the Gulf, since Russia was already suffering from inability to have the mid to long-term loans from the Western institutions. As an alternative, they looked into the Gulf states. So it was more from the Gulf towards Russia, but there has been the cases of Russian investments in the Gulf as well. But I don't think, unless if anyone wants to add, but I don't think there are substantial ones.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few points on this. Yeah, building on what Rauf was saying, it's first of all, the Russians have been trying to some degree to expand their investment footprint in the UAE. The investment footprint that was coming through from the Russian Direct Investment Fund as of Vladimir Putin's 2019 visit to the UAE was targeting around $1.3 billion in investments, basically done through 10 major deals and investment partners. So that there is Russian investment coming in. Dubai obviously is an important safe haven now for Russian assets, especially as Western options, including Switzerland and Monaco, start getting squeezed from the tax haven point of view. Also, in addition to with the investments that the Emiratis are trying to pump into Russia, which has got a $10 billion target, there is cooperation between the Russians and the Emiratis on joint projects. In particular, we should watch for the joint projects between Rosatom and Dubai Emirate in, for example, the Arctic on these type of things. Some of those things could be put under sanctions. And we just saw the movement of one of the leading Emirati banks, which is Mashreq Bank, to halt bank loans after investing $3 billion inside Russia. So concern about credit, jointly financed projects, things like this, these things could be called into question. And much like Russian-Iranian trade, much like Russian-Iranian relations, this was coming at a moment where Russian and Emirati foreign trade was having a lot of momentum. It hit $4 billion at the end of last year, which was a 21% increase from the previous year. So we're seeing momentum being stalled in Russia-Gulf economic relations. And the Emirates is really where the investments are probably going to be situated mostly, as well as, of course, any investments that are being going back and forth with Qatar. A brief note on Iraq, because it was brought up. The Iraqi reaction to this crisis has been really quite interesting. And it's officially the Iraqi state is neutral. But there is also a deep internal polarization within the country. I mean, the PMF and some of the pro-Iranian militias have generally toed the line of the Houthis and Assad and being more supportive of it. But there were Vladimir Putin posters and protests happening, I believe, in Baghdad, and the Iraqi authorities called it off after a few hours, banned any kind of expression of support for Russia, and disassembled them. So the Iraqi government itself is a little worried about this crisis creating more polarizations and rifts unnecessarily, not just because of the ideological divisions about the merits of whether Russia should go into Ukraine, because that's not really that important, but because this crisis is also exacerbating several problems inside Iraq, in particular food insecurity, food price inflation. The Iraqis are heavily dependent on Ukrainian sunflower oil, for example. So that's becoming something of a problem. And now there is the moment where the Iraqi economy was dealing with Western companies leaving and had Russian fitting the bill in terms of investments, about $14 billion in the oil sector alone, Rosneft getting more involved. And now if Russia's under sanctions and Western countries are coming back in, there could be a lot of transitions and dislocations where Russian investment is getting frozen and Western investment is not coming in to make it up. And things could be uncertain. So there's a lot of uncertainties from Iraq's point of view, and this crisis affects it in many different ways. So I just wanted to add that about the Iraqi position.
Yes, Diana.
just a few notes about the Moscow's policies on building this economic interdependence. I think what Moscow tried for a long time, and I think Dr. Rauf Mammadov also mentioned that that it's not just trying to build this economic interdependence with the West and what was happening in energy sector, but also with the Gulf states. And here also just interestingly how Gulf states were also targeting not just, for example, Lukoil or Rosneft, but just recently they made United Arab Emirates investment to Sibur, and the company, it's one of the most kind of expanding, and I think this is very strategic investment occurred because they aims to be now like three top I think Russian kind of companies, and because I'm myself from Republic of Tatarstan, and for example the companies of Tatarstan like Nizhnekamsk Neftekhim or the Tatneft, they became now part of Sibur, and for example Nizhnekamsk Neftekhim's assets, they were like the Mercedes assets. So I'm just trying to give you some sense of how big investments, how big company were. And then the other thing as well about the indirect impact of the conflict as well. We know, for example, this the North Stream 2 pipeline. It's expected between between the Russian Gazprom and then another 5 European companies, and one of the companies OMV company and shareholder of which 25% of Mubadala, United Arab Emirates Mubadala holding, which also gives some sense how about this interdependence and how all of this conflict also are related.
Wow. This leads me, unfortunately, to the end of the program, and we have the normal roundup. And my roundup's question is going to be a little bit more specific. I personally am persuaded that this is not going to be a quick war, that this war is going to drag on. It's not going to be an insurgency, that the Ukrainians will be able to hang on and defend a significant part of the country. As the war drags on, I see the United States working harder and harder to try and isolate Russia from the entire world, if at all possible. Obviously, they're not going to pull it off in China, but the Gulf states are important. So, beginning with Dr. Katz, first of all, how willing is the United States to actually turn the screws on countries in the Gulf, in your opinion? And then for all, where do we go? And if you could keep it down, everybody down maybe a minute or two, we're running out of time. Where do we go with a prolonged war in Ukraine?
I think you're right. I think it could be a prolonged war, and even if the Ukrainian government falls, I think it will be an insurgency. But either way, it's going to be Russia's going to be fighting there for a good long time. I also think that I would not like to say America putting the screws on, but I think America will work to persuade our Gulf partners to see things our way. And I think that we will be more successful in that. I think that to the extent that the Saudis, the UAE have been more sympathetic toward the Russians, I think it was based on the assumption that the Russians were going to win and the US was going to lose. I think the GCC countries want to be associated with the winners, or at least not with the losers, that's for sure. And I think also if they see the real possibility of American relations with Iran increasing, they're going to draw some conclusions that, Russia can't help them if it's bogged down in Ukraine. So I actually think that, with a diplomatic effort, that the U.S. will be able to work with the GCC partners more successfully than it has. Thank you.
Dr. Galieva, a long war.
I think yes, because it's related with the roots of the conflict of the war. It's between Russia and the West, and I think that we are going to see for long what will happen, and I cannot give any predictions what actually happened.
There's a very honest person. Dr. Mammadov.
isn't it already a long war from Putin's perspective? I mean, this guy was thinking of finishing in 2 days, so it's already a long war. There is a bad deja vu of Chechen urban warfare that Russian military elite is afraid of. There is this under performance, or I should say, how the bubble was blown of that Russian myth of being the best soldiers in the world. But I think it's already protracted. Technically, I mean, in reality, I don't think Ukraine can actually withstand militarily more than it actually has done. But they have been brave. But there is this limited capacity politically, geopolitically, and in terms of communicating this message to the world. I think Ukraine has already won it, and as people, they have already won it. So that's my prediction for that. I would be brave to say that. But I think Putin lost it on February 25th when he failed to take Kiev from inside. He already lost it. Every day he's running against the time, and every day it's just more sanctions and less wiggle room for the dialogue. That's my perspective. Thank you.
I could just offer one personal perspective. I'm a student of military history. The Russian campaign in Ukraine has all the evidence of a autarkic political leader who decided that he was going to run the war himself rather than let the generals decide how to run the war. And wrapping up, Samuel.
Yeah, I basically agree with the assessments everyone here. This war is not going to be won easily, and it's already taken too long because the Kiev should have already fallen by now. Just looking at the logistics of how things are moving, it looks as if Mariupol, which is the key bridge between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine, is still yet to fall. They're taking over terrain, particularly in the northeast of Ukraine, but the actual movement towards major population centers in northern and northeastern Ukraine seems to have stagnated over the past 72 hours. You, of course, have that 60-mile-long convoy to Kiev, logistical supply issues. A lot of the problems that the Russian military was supposed to have ironed out after the 2008 Georgian War still seem to be problems today and being exposed even in greater fashion because Russia has not been as successful in terms of using disinformation or cyber or other alternative non-military tactics alongside this. So I think we're looking in for a long war, and we're looking in eventually for the isolation of Russia increasingly from the global economy. I mean, the United States' ban on American oil and Russian oil is an interesting step. The Brits just announced while we were on this panel that they're going to be phasing out all oil imports from Russia by the end of 2022. Not as soon as many people would have wanted, but that's a big step. Other European countries are probably going to take longer to do that, but it's abundantly clear that Qatar is very well positioned in all of this, and it's no coincidence that Luigi Di Maio and the Italians were meeting with the Qataris just 2 days ago, trying to get new contracts to make up for it. And Italy is important in this equation because Mario Draghi was the most outspoken supporter of exempting energy in the European Union from the Russia sanctions, and they have about 40% of their oil and gas coming from Russia, and without the nuclear and other alternatives that Germany has been trying to deal with. So if the Italians are moving in that direction, that's a sign that Qatar is going to be an important gas supplier for many other European countries going forward, and they're probably the long-term winners from this.
Okay, that was a great discussion. Opened up a whole bunch of new questions I wish we'd had time to address. I'd like to thank all of you for participation, thank our audience. Remind the audience that the next important event of the Gulf International Forum will be it's an event celebrating Women's History Month. We will discuss the women's role in the defense of the Gulf and security in the Gulf on Wednesday, the 23rd of March of this year. Thank you all very much.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yes.
Today is International Women's Day, and we haven't congratulated Diana.
Okay.
So my congratulations just at the end.
For surviving in such an overwhelmingly male world. Diana, congratulations. Thank you.